So today we're going to take a look at this beautiful 1960 Olds, and what an interesting license plate there. It's pretty clever, 60 Olds. And this one is for sale on Charles Phoenix's website, charlesphoenix.com, just like it sounds, CharlesPhoenix.com. It's a beautiful 40,000-mile copy of a 1960 Dynamic 88, not the Super 88, not the 98, but the Dynamic 88, the lower-priced full-size Oldsmobile for 1960. Now, take a look up front. Olds sported a very, wasn't very Oldsmobile-y like grille up front. This was before Oldsmobile had defined that twin-port look starting in 1968. It was before the Tornado. And I think the 1959 Olds had a beautiful front end, but the 60 was just different in so many ways, and I think I like it. I just don't think that it says Oldsmobile, at least to my eye. I do like the 61 Olds front end a lot on the 88s with the block lettering. I think that might be one of my favorites. But regardless, this is a super cool front end. I suspect that the reason why the 60 Olds, along with some of the other 1960 automobiles, like the Pontiac in particular, don't necessarily have a lot of the typical brand character traits is because they were rush jobs, just like the 59s. And so there wasn't a lot of time to take the 59s and what was done there and kind of reinvent it and evolve to the next step for 1960. And that's one of the reasons why on the 60 Pontiac, you don't see that split grille that was introduced in 1959. It would come back in 1961, though, once it was known that that was a popular styling theme and that customers liked it. But by the time they were designing the 60s, it was already too late to integrate that design language into the car. But here on the 60 Olds, the front end I do think is cool. I love kind of the floating linear bars there that are formed within rectangles. That's kind of cool. Very few cars have a grille like that. I love the little 88 scripts in between the headlamps. It's also a nice touch in how that Oldsmobile badge kind of forms this prow on the hood and the midsection of the hood, and the fact that there's quite a bit of plan view here. You can see that this is not a flat front. There's a lot of dimension and curvature to the front end of the car. Now, as we rotate around to the side of the car, we can see why General Motors was known for styling in this time frame. Take a look at the beautiful sculpture here, in particular that little cove that is created that comes off of the hood, wraps around onto the fender, and then runs the length of the car. That cove gets deeper and deeper as it goes rearward. And notice that by the absolute rear of the car, it's kind of created this fin on the top, this horizontal fin, and then there's this scalloped out section underneath the fin that provides this low light and a beautiful lighting contrast that you can see here. And, of course, you have that full-width molding that runs the entire length of the car from the front all the way to the rear that accentuates another piece of, let's say, body side surfacing, and particularly how it dives down after the rear wheel, and it creates room for that Dynamic 88 script. Another thing I would point out here is notice the wraparound front windshield. Very typical for this particular time frame. Automakers were trying to advertise that they had great visibility, and that was one way that they had great visibility. You'll notice an outside rear view mirror on the left front fender. There's no outside rear view mirror on the passenger side here, as was typical during this time frame. Some cars, including my 1959 Parisienne, don't even have a left-hand outside rear view mirror. They only have the inside rear view mirror in the middle, and that's because, to be honest, you really don't need it. You have panoramic vision in these cars. You just turn your head and look. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but like I said, the visibility is completely there, unlike today's cars that have chunky A, B, and C pillars. These obviously have very, very thin pillars and light roofs that give you this airy greenhouse and sense inside that you really can see 360 degrees around you, and it's largely because you can. And as we rotate to this more bird's eye-like view, you can see that cove that I was talking about, particularly as it gets deeper and deeper at the back end of the car. And that's one of the things that it's a little bit unfortunate this car is a dark color, because that cove would really show off the low light contrasted with the highlight on top on a light colored car. The darker colored cars like this don't quite show it, although, well, dark colors look great on this car too. And you can see here the roof, that very, very thin roof, so different from the GM vehicles of just a few years prior, that was unquestionably inspired by the 1957 Chrysler products that had these beautiful thin roof designs. And GM, I'm sure the stylist thought that it just made a heck of a lot of sense here as well. Now notice the back end, the taillights are pretty pointy, something you certainly couldn't do today. You don't want to back into anything, you'll impale it, but it sure does look cool. And one last photo here of the dead-on rear view of this 60 Olds. Take a look at those tail lamps. I just love everything about this rear end, even the frowny face or mustache-like bumper there that covers the reverse lights, as well as these bumper guards that, let's say, aren't going to guard anything. They're just there purely for looks. Beautiful trim panel in between the reverse lights as well. And you have kind of the inverse theme on the deck lid that you have on the hood. Here you've got this section in the middle that is sunk in a little bit or is bordered by creases that flank that Oldsmobile logo in the middle, whereas the hood you had a little bit of a bulge. So you certainly have a super interesting rear, accentuating the width in a number of ways. That lower trim panel with those long horizontal lines, and then of course the Oldsmobile block lettering that accentuates the width, not only because each letter is so spaced out from the other one, but because the font is also kind of pinched in the vertical direction. You can see the font really is quite wide overall. The letters are made almost like you took a picture and then you stretched it. But, you know, it looks cool, and the back end on this car, I think, is just my favorite angle of the entire vehicle. Now, as we rotate inside, this is a Dynamic 88 after all, so it doesn't have a super plush interior, but this is the original fabric, the original door panels, and beautiful carpets. Take a look at that steering wheel. That's a safety-style steering wheel, Oldsmobile used to call it, because the center section of the hub there is depressed. Remember, cars like the 55, 56, 57 Chevys had this center hub that actually protruded outward. And so if you got in a crash, you kind of got impaled by that center hub. Here, the idea was that that would not happen. This was in the days before the collapsible steering column. So if you're hitting this, you're hitting a very hard object in a crash. But everything is stylized, from the accelerator and the brake pedal, which were unique to Oldsmobile, to the gear shift lever. I love, you have kind of a Oldsmobile-like variation of the twin cockpit theme here that let's look at in greater detail in a second. But the passenger side kind of mirrors the driver's side, except the passenger, of course, doesn't have a speedometer. But the IP, you can see, flows very similarly on either side. Here's a better close-up of the IP and that steering wheel that I was mentioning, the safety steering wheel. Notice the transmission shift indicator here is not PRN DSL, it's PND SLR, reverses all the way at the end. This was before the shift quadrants were standardized. This is a old-school hydromatic transmission, the 4-speed hydromatic that GM had. Very reliable and durable transmission. 1960 was really a great year for Oldsmobile. I love the styling of the 61s, but 61 was the first year for Oldsmobile's roto-hydromatic that they used in everything. And it was just a terrible transmission. Had the same shift quadrant as the hydromatic, but it was a totally different transmission, and it just was not very reliable, especially when compared with the old school hydromatic that is in this Oldsmobile. And Oldsmobile, by the way, saddled Pontiac, the short wheelbase Pontiacs, with that roto-hydromatic too, in order to defray the cost. So you're best to get a Bonneville if you want a Pontiac from 1961 to 1963, or you can get a Star Chief, but don't get the shorter wheelbase Pontiacs like the Catalina. And here we just have a close-up of the instrument panel and the speedometer. This is a rolling drum style speedometer. It kind of spins and then changes color the faster that you go. Interestingly, Oldsmobile would continue using the rolling drum speedometer all the way through cars like the 66 Tornado, through the 1970 Tornado. But on this car, they don't really advertise that that's how the speedometer is executed. On that Tornado, they do. It really is a drum that you can see visually rotate. It's the exact same principle. It just is a different way that it displays the speed, as opposed to the drum rotating and having markings on it for the speed. Here the drum just rotates and has a color and kind of fills up to the right as the speed increases. So same principle, just a little different. Oldsmobile used it for many years. Now, under hood in your Dynamic 88, you didn't quite get the big Oldsmobile Rocket V8 that you would get if you had the Super 88 or the 98. If you got either of the latter, you would have a 394 cubic inch Oldsmobile Rocket V8, but the Dynamic 88 had to make do with a 371 cubic inch V8 breathing through a two-barrel carburetor, had 8.75 to 1 compression ratio, a little bit lower than the 9.75 to 1 compression ratio that was found in the 394 that was used under hood in the Super 88 and 98. And as a result, you had lower horsepower, 240 horsepower, gross horsepower in the Dynamic 88 versus 315 in the Super 88 and 98. So the Super 88 and 98 did have considerably more horsepower than the Dynamic 88. But you know what? The Dynamic 88 and the way that it operates, I will tell you, these Rocket V8s are just so smooth and just such a pleasure to drive. You know, it really doesn't matter. Even the Dynamic 88 with the regular fuel V8 is still super pleasant and quiet and just pushes the car around relatively effortlessly, especially with the 4-speed Hydra-Matic that this car has that is optional. An interesting thing about the 4-speed Hydra-Matics, if you've never driven one, first gear is a really short first gear, and it shifts out under normal acceleration at about 8 to 10 miles per hour. So you kind of go through the 1 to 2 shift really fast, and then the 2 to 3 shift, not only is it shifting, but it's also partially locking up the fluid coupling in the transmission. So if you drive one of these with the old school Hydra-Matics, I'll try to do my best impression. Hopefully nobody will laugh. Probably some of you will. But if you go through the gears between the 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and then 3 to 4 shift, the transmissions kind of sound like this taking off. So that 2 to 3 shift is really an acceleration killer, I'll call it. The RPM drops way down. The first gear really shifts out quickly. And I think they did that because this is a fluid coupling in the Hydra-Matic transmission, not a torque converter. So it's not multiplying torque like the later torque converters would in the Turbo Hydra-Matic 400, for instance. So you really need that short first gear to get off the line quickly. But regardless, these Hydra-Matics really were quite effective and, as I said, durable. And when paired with this 371 cubic inch V8, it was a really nice pairing and in a beautiful car overall. I don't know how you could say this car is anything other than just space age and gorgeous and beautifully sculpted. It's one of my favorite Oldsmobiles of all time. What do you think? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.